The Nexary Imperial War College possessed all the architectural subtlety of a species that had conquered half the known galaxy through sheer technological superiority and an insufferable belief in their own intellectual magnificence. Crystalline spires twisted skyward like frozen screams of triumph, each surface polished to mirror brightness, so that visiting dignitaries might glimpse their own inadequacy reflected infinitely in Nexary craftsmanship. Professor Zephik adjusted his ceremonial teaching robes, because apparently even academic dress required 17 different medals indicating various degrees of theoretical excellence, and surveyed his classroom with the satisfied air of someone who had never needed to test his theories against anything more dangerous than a particularly argumentative thesis committee. The lecture hall itself was a masterpiece of intimidation disguised as education. Tiered seating arranged in perfect concentric circles, each row elevated just enough to remind occupants of their place in the grand hierarchy of learning. Holographic displays flickered with complex mathematical equations that looked impressive and meant absolutely nothing to anyone who had actually held a weapon in anger. Today's audience represented the finest military minds from across the Galactic Confederation, or at least, the finest military minds whose species had been deemed worthy of Nexary enlightenment. Commander Thane of the Vortak Hegemony sat with the rigid posture of someone desperately trying to look intelligent while understanding roughly half the words being used. Admiral Crix's tentacles twitched with what could have been either deep thought or suppressed irritation. With Zephirians, the distinction was often academic. And in the very back row, almost hidden in the shadows where the elegant lighting design had apparently given up trying, sat a figure that most of the other students had politely ignored. Human, by all appearances, though the military bearing suggested someone who had earned their seat through considerably more practical means than the usual diplomatic channels. Zephik cleared his throat with the precise cadence of someone who had practiced the gesture in front of a mirror until it conveyed exactly the right amount of intellectual authority. "Distinguished colleagues," he began, his voice carrying the sort of resonant confidence that only comes from years of never being meaningfully challenged. "Today we examine the primitive warfare methodologies employed by lesser civilizations, and how proper theoretical frameworks can illuminate their fundamental inadequacies." The holographic display shimmered to life, showing a three-dimensional battlefield complete with tiny animated figures representing various combat scenarios. Everything looked very clean and organized, the sort of warfare that might be conducted by particularly methodical accountants. Consider, if you will, the barbaric tendency toward direct confrontation exhibited by militaristic species. Zephik gestured grandly at the display, where neat formations of soldiers advanced in perfectly straight lines toward equally neat formations of enemies. Their crude emphasis on what they term battlefield experience blinds them to the elegant mathematical principles that govern all military engagement. A few tentacles and appendages moved in what passed for note-taking among the assembled species. Commander Thane's expression suggested someone working very hard to look enlightened while fighting off a growing suspicion that he was missing something important. Now, you might ask, and indeed, you should ask, as questioning is the hallmark of the educated mind, what evidence supports these theoretical frameworks? Zephyk's smile carried the warmth of a tax auditor explaining why your deductions had been rejected. I point you to recent conflicts where such primitive approaches have met with predictable results. The display shifted to show tactical analyses of several recent military engagements. Neat arrows indicated troop movements, statistical overlays provided casualty projections, and everything looked very scientific and conclusive. What the displays notably failed to convey was the screaming, the confusion, the moment when theoretical frameworks met the universe's well-documented tendency to ignore academic predictions entirely. Take, for instance, the recent Nexary expeditions into the Outer Rim territories, Zephik continued, warming to his subject like a cat settling into a sunbeam. Despite facing numerically superior forces employing these so-called practical combat techniques, our theoretically grounded approach should have resulted in decisive victory. The word should hung in the air, with the weight of several thousand casualties who had apparently failed to read the theoretical predictions about their survival chances. Of course, Zephik added with the sort of casual dismissal that academic types reserve for inconvenient facts, temporary tactical setbacks are inevitable when dealing with opponents who refuse to engage according to established strategic paradigms. Their unpredictability is itself a form of ignorance, a failure to understand the mathematical certainties that govern all military conflict. From the back of the room came a soft sound that might have been a chuckle, quickly suppressed. Several students turned to look, but the figure in the shadows remained motionless. Zephik's lecture continued, building momentum like a runaway freight train loaded with questionable assumptions. The fundamental error of experience-based military thinking lies in its reactive nature. These primitive commanders respond to immediate circumstances rather than adhering to proven theoretical models. They adapt. He spoke the word as if it were a particularly distasteful form of intellectual weakness, instead of maintaining doctrinal consistency. More holographic displays flickered to life, showing elaborate flowcharts and decision trees that mapped out proper military responses to various scenarios. Everything was color-coded and cross-referenced, a beautiful testament to the necessary belief that reality could be adequately summarized in a sufficiently detailed PowerPoint presentation. Consider the human military approach, for instance, Zephik said, his tone suggesting he was about to discuss something found on the bottom of his shoe. Their so-called flexible tactics are simply evidence of a species too intellectually limited to develop consistent strategic doctrine. They improvise because they lack the cognitive capacity for proper planning. The soft sound from the back of the room came again, slightly louder this time. A few more heads turned, but the figure remained still. Their recent interference in necessary expansion efforts provides an excellent case study, Zephik continued, apparently oblivious to the growing tension in the room. Despite overwhelming technological disadvantages, they somehow managed to disrupt carefully planned operations through sheer luck, one might charitably call it. He gestured at a new display showing the Kepler station engagement, where necessary forces had somehow managed to lose a strategically crucial position despite every theoretical advantage. The sanitized tactical overview made it look like a simple matter of statistical probability rather than the three-day nightmare of urban warfare that had actually occurred. The human commander in this engagement, Zephik said, consulting his notes with the air of someone discussing an interesting but ultimately irrelevant historical footnote, employed tactics that violated every established principle of proper military science. Irregular formations, adaptive strategies, exploitation of terrain features not covered in standard doctrine, the sort of primitive improvisation one might expect from a species that still resolves disputes through physical violence. This time the sound from the back was definitely a chuckle, and it carried the sort of dark amusement that makes career military officers reach instinctively for their sidearms. Perhaps, came a voice from the shadows, quiet but carrying clearly through the suddenly attentive lecture hall, you'd like to elaborate on those irregular formations. Every head in the room turned. Zephik blinked with the startled expression of someone who had just discovered that his theoretical framework had developed the ability to talk back. I beg your pardon, he said, his voice carrying just a hint of the indignation that academics reserve for students who dare to interrupt their monologues. The figure in the back row leaned forward slightly, and the improved lighting revealed features that were unmistakably human and unmistakably female. More importantly, the shoulders carried the sort of bearing that suggests someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, even when giving orders that sound completely insane at the time. The Kepler station engagement, she said, her tone conversational but with an undercurrent that made several students instinctively sit up straighter. You mentioned irregular formations. I'm curious about your analysis of their effectiveness. Zephik's expression suggested someone who had just been asked to explain quantum mechanics to a particularly inquisitive 5-year-old. My dear, I'm sorry, I don't believe we've been introduced. General Kira Voss, she replied, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Human Defense Coalition. I believe you mentioned my species' intellectual limitations. The silence that followed had the quality of a held breath, the moment between lightning and thunder when the universe pauses to consider whether things are about to get very interesting indeed. Zephik's composure remained intact, though several micro-expressions flickered across his features like a computer running diagnostic checks on its own circuitry. General Voss. Yes, of course. Your presence here is educational, I'm sure. Though I should point out that this is an advanced theoretical course, not a practical workshop. The dismissal was expertly delivered, wrapped in enough politeness to maintain plausible deniability, while making it clear that military experience was a poor substitute for proper academic credentials. General Voss smiled, and it was not the sort of smile that appeared in diplomatic photographs. Theoretical. Yes, I gathered that from your analysis. Tell me, Professor, in your theoretical framework, how do you account for variables that don't fit established models? An excellent question, Zephik replied, visibly relieved to be back on familiar academic ground. Proper theoretical analysis accounts for all relevant variables through comprehensive modeling. When apparently anomalous results occur, it typically indicates either measurement error or failure to properly understand the underlying principles at work. Measurement error, General Voss repeated thoughtfully. So when your forces lost the Kepler station despite overwhelming advantages, that was measurement error. The question hung in the air, like a challenge written in letters of fire. Commander Thane's expression suggested someone watching a traffic accident in slow motion, while Admiral Crix's tentacles had gone completely still, never a good sign in Zephyrian body language. Zephyk's smile remained perfectly calibrated, though a careful observer might have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes. Temporary tactical setbacks are inevitable when dealing with chaotic variables, General. The key is maintaining theoretical consistency rather than allowing isolated incidents to undermine established doctrine. Isolated incidents, General Voss mused. Like the Kepler station, and the Arcturus mining colony, and the entire Outer Rim campaign that's been stalled for 6 months despite your overwhelming technological superiority. Each example landed with the precision of a surgical strike. The assembled students exchanged glances that conveyed volumes about the gap between official reports and actual results. General, Zephik said, his tone acquiring the sort of patience that professors use when dealing with particularly obtuse undergraduates, I understand that field experience can provide a limited perspective on military affairs. But surely you recognize the value of comprehensive theoretical analysis over mere anecdotal observation. The condescension was beautifully executed, wrapped in enough academic courtesy to maintain the moral high ground while making it clear that practical experience was a poor substitute for proper intellectual rigor. General Voss leaned back in her chair, and her expression suggested someone who had just been presented with a particularly amusing joke. Professor Zephik, I have a question for you. Of course. I'm always happy to engage with inquisitive minds, regardless of their background. Should I sit this one out? General Voss said, her voice carrying the sort of quiet intensity that makes smart people start looking for exits or speak from experience. The question seemed innocuous enough, phrased with the casual air of someone asking about the weather. But something in the delivery made the assembled students lean forward with a collective realization that they were about to witness something memorable. Zephik's expression suggested someone who had just been asked a riddle in a language he almost but not quite understood. I'm not sure I follow your meaning, General. General Voss stood up, and the movement had the fluid precision of someone whose muscle memory had been calibrated through years of situations where hesitation meant death. Well, Professor, I'm trying to decide whether I should let you continue your lecture on primitive human tactics, or whether I should mention that I was a human commander at Kepler Station. The silence that followed was the sort that usually precedes explosions, natural disasters, or the end of academic careers. Every face in the room turned toward General Voss with expressions ranging from fascination to horror to the sort of morbid curiosity usually reserved for traffic accidents. Zephik's perfectly calibrated professorial composure developed several visible cracks. That is, you were the barbaric primitive who employed irregular formations, General Voss continued helpfully. The intellectually limited improviser who somehow managed to disrupt your carefully planned operations through sheer luck. The chaotic variable that didn't fit your established models. She began walking down the tiered steps toward the front of the lecture hall, and each footstep echoed with the weight of several thousand theoretical assumptions crumbling into dust. Now, I'm happy to sit quietly while you continue explaining how my species' cognitive limitations prevented us from developing proper strategic doctrine, she said, her tone remaining conversational, while managing to convey the distinct impression that sitting quietly was not actually her preferred option. Or, if you'd prefer, I could share some insights about what it's actually like when your beautiful theoretical frameworks meet an opponent who refuses to follow the script. Zephik's mouth opened and closed several times, producing no sound beyond a faint strangled noise that might have been the death rattle of academic authority. For instance, General Voss continued, Now standing directly in front of the holographic display showing the sanitized tactical overview of Kepler Station, your analysis here shows our forces using irregular formations, as if that was some sort of strategic failing. But those irregular formations were specifically designed to exploit the predictable deployment patterns your theoretical doctrine required. She gestured at the neat arrows and statistical overlays with a sort of casual dismissal, usually reserved for particularly obvious mistakes on undergraduate exams. You see, Professor, when you reduce warfare to mathematical models, you create systems that can be gamed by anyone willing to think outside your parameters. The holographic display flickered, and suddenly the clean tactical overview was replaced by something considerably more complex, a real-time recreation of the Kepler Station battle that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the academic version. Your forces deployed exactly as doctrine predicted, General Voss said, her voice taking on the sort of pedagogical tone that Zephik had been using moments before. Textbook formations, optimal positioning, proper coordination between units. It was beautiful to watch, from a theoretical perspective. The recreation showed Nexary forces advancing in perfect formation, every movement coordinated according to established doctrine. It looked exactly like something that would earn high marks in a military academy simulation. The problem with textbook tactics, General Voss continued, is that textbooks are written by people who assume their opponents have also read the textbook. The display shifted to show the human defensive positions, or rather, the apparent lack thereof. Instead of neat formations facing the Nexary advance, the human forces seemed scattered almost randomly across the battlefield. Irregular formations, General Voss said with evident amusement. Also known as not being where your enemy expects you to be when they expect you to be there. It's a remarkably simple concept that somehow never makes it into theoretical frameworks. Commander Thane raised a tentative appendage. But surely numerical superiority and technological advantage should have, General Voss agreed. That word does a lot of heavy lifting in military theory, doesn't it, Professor? Zephik had achieved the sort of perfect stillness usually associated with small animals, hoping that predators won't notice them if they don't move. The thing about technological advantage, General Voss continued, is that it tends to create certain assumptions about how engagements will proceed. Your forces expected resistance at specific choke points, prepared for defensive positions that conform to established tactical doctrine, brought the sort of overwhelming firepower that makes quick work of conventional resistance. The recreation showed exactly that, Nexary units deploying heavy weapons toward positions where human forces should have been, according to every reasonable tactical prediction. What they weren't prepared for, General Voss said, was an opponent who had no intention of fighting the kind of battle they were equipped to win. The display shifted again, and now the scattered human positions revealed their purpose. Instead of confronting Nexary forces directly, they had positioned themselves to attack supply lines, communication nodes, and command structures that had been left lightly defended because proper theoretical doctrine indicated they were not primary objectives. Primitive improvisation, General Voss noted with satisfaction. Also known as winning by changing the rules of the game while your opponent is still reading the rulebook. Admiral Crix's tentacles were now writhing with what was definitely agitation. But the casualty projections, the mathematical models clearly indicated that you would win, General Voss finished. Yes, I saw those projections. Very impressive mathematics. Unfortunately, mathematics is a well-documented weakness when it comes to accounting for opponents who refuse to behave mathematically. She turned back to Zephik, who had managed to achieve an even more perfect stillness, like a statue commemorating the exact moment when academic arrogance met practical reality. Professor, would you like to continue your lecture on the intellectual limitations of human military thinking? Because I have to say, from where I'm standing, those limitations seem to have worked out remarkably well. The silence stretched on, filled with the sort of tension usually associated with diplomatic incidents or the moment just before someone gets thrown out of a very high window. Finally, Zephik managed to produce something resembling speech. That is, the analysis was based on preliminary reports. Preliminary reports written by people who needed to explain why theoretically superior forces had been outmaneuvered by intellectually limited primitives, General Voss said helpfully. I imagine that required some creative interpretation of events. She gestured toward the holographic display, which was now showing the actual casualty figures from Kepler station, numbers that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the theoretical projections. The beautiful thing about theoretical frameworks, she continued, is that they work perfectly right up until the moment they encounter reality. At which point, you have two choices: modify your theories to account for what actually happened, or decide that reality was clearly mistaken. Her gaze swept across the assembled students, most of whom were displaying expressions suggesting their worldviews were undergoing rapid and uncomfortable revision. Now, I don't want to completely undermine Professor Zepfik's excellent lecture, General Voss said, though her tone suggested she was entirely comfortable with doing exactly that. Theoretical analysis has its place in military planning, but that place is as a starting point, not a destination. She moved to stand beside the holographic display, which was now showing detailed tactical analyses that bore no resemblance to the sanitized version Zephik had presented. The problem with pure theoretical approaches is that they assume warfare is a science with predictable laws and consistent results. In reality, it's more like improvisational theater performed by people with explosives. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the audience, though whether from amusement or hysteria was difficult to determine. Every battle is unique because every battle involves conscious opponents who are actively trying to disrupt your plans while executing plans of their own that you're simultaneously trying to disrupt. It's a recursive feedback loop of decision-making under pressure, where the only constant is that whatever you expected to happen probably won't. She turned back to Zephik, who had managed to regain some color in his features, though he still looked like someone who had just witnessed the heat death of the universe. Professor, I'm curious, in your theoretical framework, how do you account for the fact that your most recent temporary tactical setback cost the Nexari Empire roughly 3,000 casualties in a strategically crucial position, while the primitives you're describing lost, let me see, 17 personnel and a transport shuttle? The numbers hung in the air, like an accusation. Commander Thane's expression suggested someone doing rapid mental calculations, while trying not to look as horrified as he felt. Zepfik's mouth worked silently for several seconds before producing a sound that might charitably be described as words. The full strategic picture. There were complications, variables that... Variables, General Voss repeated thoughtfully. Yes, that's what we call them in theoretical analysis. In practical terms, we usually refer to them as the enemy doing something we didn't expect because we assumed they were too stupid to think of it. She walked back toward her seat, though the movement somehow managed to convey the impression that she was graciously allowing the lecture to continue rather than surrendering the floor. Please, Professor, she said, settling back into her chair with the satisfied air of someone who had just completed a particularly enjoyable demolition project. Don't let me interrupt your analysis of primitive tactical thinking. I'm learning so much about how intellectual superiority translates into battlefield effectiveness. The sarcasm was delivered with surgical precision, wrapped in enough politeness to maintain plausible deniability while making it absolutely clear that Zepfik's credibility had just been reduced to its component atoms. Zephik stared at his notes for a long moment, apparently hoping that the power of theoretical analysis might somehow transform the situation into something manageable. The holographic displays continued showing the actual tactical results from Kepler station, complete with casualty figures that made his earlier analysis look like a work of creative fiction. Well, he said finally, his voice carrying the hollow ring of someone whose entire professional identity had just been fed through a wood chipper, I suppose, that is, practical experience does provide certain insights that theoretical analysis might not immediately capture. It was a masterful retreat disguised as an academic qualification, the sort of careful phrasing that allowed for graceful withdrawal while maintaining just enough dignity to avoid complete professional suicide. General Voss smiled, and this time it was the sort of smile that appeared in diplomatic photographs, warm, professional, and absolutely terrifying to anyone who understood what lay beneath it. Theoretical analysis has its place, Professor, she said graciously. It's an excellent starting point for understanding established patterns and predicting probable outcomes. But the moment you start treating theoretical models as gospel instead of guidelines, you create strategic blind spots that more flexible opponents can exploit. She gestured toward the holographic display, which was now showing comparative analyses of several recent engagements between theoretical doctrine and adaptive tactics. The pattern was depressingly consistent from a nexary perspective. The key insight, General Voss continued, is that effective military doctrine should be descriptive, not prescriptive. It should describe successful approaches to common problems, not prescribe rigid solutions to all possible scenarios. Commander Thane tentatively raised an appendage. But without consistent doctrine, how do you maintain unit coordination and strategic coherence? It was a reasonable question, and General Voss treated it with the respect it deserved rather than the dismissive condescension that had characterized most of the academic discussion. Excellent question, Commander. The answer is that you maintain coherence through shared principles rather than rigid procedures. You teach your forces to understand the underlying logic of tactical decisions, so they can adapt those decisions to unexpected circumstances. She stood up again and moved to the holographic display, which shifted to show training scenarios that looked considerably more chaotic than the neat formations in Zepfik's presentation. For instance, instead of teaching Formation 7 is the correct response to Scenario 12, you teach, when facing concentrated fire from elevated positions, prioritize disrupting enemy coordination while maintaining your own unit cohesion. The specific implementation depends on terrain, enemy capabilities, available resources, and a dozen other variables that can't be predetermined. The display showed the same tactical problem being solved in multiple ways, each adapted to different circumstances, but following the same underlying principles. It requires more training time and more intelligent personnel, General Voss admitted. It's much easier to drill troops on predetermined responses than to teach them to think critically under pressure. But the payoff is forces that can function effectively even when the situation doesn't match anything in the textbook. Admiral Crix's tentacles performed what might have been a gesture of understanding. So you're advocating for adaptive doctrine rather than rigid doctrine. I'm advocating for doctrine that acknowledges reality, General Voss replied. And the reality is that warfare is fundamentally about intelligent opponents trying to outwit each other under conditions of incomplete information and extreme stress. Any theoretical framework that doesn't account for those factors is more likely to get your people killed than to help them win. She turned back toward Zephik, who was staring at his notes with the expression of someone whose life's work had just been revealed to be an elaborate practical joke. Professor, I don't mean to completely discredit theoretical military analysis, she said, though her tone suggested she was entirely comfortable doing exactly that if necessary. Theoretical frameworks are valuable tools for understanding patterns and preparing for probable scenarios. But they are tools, not truth. The moment you start confusing your models with reality, you create vulnerabilities that practical opponents can exploit. The holographic display shifted one final time, showing a side-by-side comparison of theoretical predictions and actual results from multiple recent engagements. The gap between theory and practice was significant. The fundamental problem with pure theoretical approaches, General Voss continued, is that they assume warfare follows mathematical laws like physics or chemistry. In reality, it's more like economics or psychology, systems where conscious actors are constantly adapting their behavior based on their observations of other actors' behavior. She walked back toward her seat, but paused midway up the tiered steps. Which brings us to the question I asked earlier, Professor. Should I sit this one out and let you continue explaining how primitive human tactics represent an intellectual failing? Or should I speak from experience about what happens when theoretical frameworks encounter opponents who refuse to behave theoretically? The question hung in the air like a challenge, though at this point it was more of a rhetorical flourish than an actual request for guidance. Zephik looked up from his notes with the expression of someone who had just realized that his theoretical framework for handling difficult students had never accounted for students who could dismantle his entire curriculum through personal experience. I think, he said carefully, that we would all benefit from a more comprehensive perspective on modern military challenges. It was a graceful surrender disguised as academic open-mindedness, the sort of careful phrasing that allowed for strategic retreat while maintaining enough dignity to show up for work the next day. General Voss smiled and settled back into her chair. Excellent. Then perhaps we can discuss some practical approaches to the theoretical challenges you've identified. And with that, The Nexary Imperial War College experienced something that had never appeared in any of their theoretical frameworks, a lecture on military science delivered by someone who had actually won a war recently. The irony was not lost on the assembled students, though most of them were still processing the cognitive dissonance of watching their professor's expertise evaporate in real time. Commander Thane's expression suggested someone whose worldview was undergoing emergency reconstruction, while Admiral Crix's tentacles had settled into what might have been thoughtful contemplation or possibly shell shock. As for Professor Zephik, he spent the remainder of the session taking notes on his own subject matter, delivered by someone whose credentials included actually implementing the tactics he had been theorizing about. It was, he reflected privately, a remarkably humbling experience for someone whose previous understanding of humility had been largely theoretical. The Nexary Imperial War College continued to possess all the architectural subtlety of a species convinced of their own intellectual magnificence. But for the first time in its distinguished history, the crystalline spires reflected something other than theoretical certainty. They reflected the uncomfortable realization that reality had a disturbing tendency to disagree with even the most elegant academic conclusions. And in the back row of Lecture Hall 7, General Kira Voss settled into complete an education that had apparently been missing some crucial practical components. After all, someone had to teach the teachers what they should have learned before they started teaching.